A teenage king was buried in gold, sealed inside a mountain of rock for over 3,000 years. And when scientists finally looked closely enough at what was left of his body, they found something no one expected. Not a knife wound, not poison, something worse. A body that had been failing quietly and relentlessly from the moment he was born, the product of a decision made generations before he ever took the throne. This is the story of what actually killed Tutankhamun, and why the newest evidence makes his death feel less like a mystery and more like a slow-motion collision that nobody could have stopped. To understand how a king could die at 18 or 19 years old, you have to go back to the world he was born into, a world already cracking apart. His father, Akhenaten, had taken one of the most powerful religious systems in the ancient world and tried to tear it down almost overnight. For centuries, Egypt had worshipped a wide pantheon of gods, with powerful priesthoods controlling enormous wealth and land, especially the priests of Amun at Thebes. Akhenaten changed all of that. He declared that only one god mattered, the sun disk Aten, shut down the old temples, relocated the entire capital to a new city built from nothing in the desert, and reshaped Egyptian art and religion around this single new belief. It was, by any measure, one of the most radical political and spiritual experiments in the ancient world, and it left the country unstable, resentful, and divided by the time Akhenaten died. Into that instability stepped a child. Tutankhamun took the throne around the age of 9 or 10, likely in the year 1333 BCE, at a moment when Egypt desperately needed stability, and got it in the form of a boy who could barely have understood the scale of what he'd inherited. He wasn't even born with the name we know him by. He started life as Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten, a name that directly honored his father's single sun god. Early in his reign, as the priesthood of the old gods was restored to power and the capital shifted back to Thebes, his name was changed to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, a symbolic reversal that tells you everything about how completely his advisors were working to undo his father's religious revolution. He reigned for roughly 9 years, and during that short reign, the old temples reopened, the traditional gods were reinstated, and the country slowly stitched itself back together, guided in large part by powerful advisors and regents who almost certainly held more real authority than the young king himself. Then, around 1324 BCE, he died. No named heir survived him, though archaeologists did find 2 mummified fetuses buried with him, generally believed to be his own stillborn daughters. His dynasty essentially ended with his death, and for over 3,000 years afterward, almost nobody remembered his name. That erasure wasn't an accident. Later pharaohs, eager to distance themselves from the chaos of the Amarna period, deliberately left Tutankhamun off official king lists. His monuments were repurposed, his name chiseled away in places, his existence folded into obscurity, which is strangely the reason we know so much about him today. Because he was forgotten, his tomb was never targeted by the large-scale looting that stripped nearly every other pharaoh's burial in the Valley of the Kings. It sat buried under debris and the entrance to a later unrelated tomb, essentially hidden in plain sight, until a British archaeologist named Howard Carter, funded by Lord Carnarvon, finally located the entrance in November 1922. What Carter found inside was almost incomprehensibly rich, thousands of objects, a nested set of coffins, and finally, a solid gold death mask that would become one of the most recognized objects on the planet. It took Carter and his team nearly 10 years just to catalog, conserve, and remove everything from the tomb, an undertaking so meticulous and so widely reported that it turned Egyptology from an obscure academic pursuit into a genuine global phenomenon, sparking a wave of Egypt-inspired fashion, architecture, and film that lasted the rest of the decade. The tomb turned an obscure boy king into the most famous pharaoh in history. But it also left behind a body, and that body held a question that took the better part of a century to even begin answering. What killed him? The first serious scientific attempt to answer that question came in 1968, when researchers x-rayed the mummy and noticed something unusual, a dense area at the base of the skull that looked like it could be the result of trauma. At the time, with limited imaging technology, this was interpreted by some as evidence of a blow to the head, and the idea that Tutankhamun had been murdered took off in the public imagination almost immediately. It made a certain kind of sense. He died young, his dynasty collapsed shortly after, and Egyptian court politics of the era were not exactly free of ambition and betrayal. The murder theory had drama, motive, and a plausible cast of suspects, and it stuck around in documentaries and popular books for decades. But better technology eventually caught up with the theory and dismantled it. In 2005, a team led by Egyptian radiologist Ashraf Selim used computed tomography, essentially a full 3-dimensional CT scan of the mummy, something far more precise than a flat X-ray from the 1960s. The scan found no evidence of a blow to the skull that could have been the cause of death. What it did find was a fracture in the left thigh bone, close to the knee, that appeared to have occurred very close to the time of death. Selim's team concluded that the skull anomaly was almost certainly a natural artifact of the mummification process, not evidence of a killing. The murder theory, at least as it had been popularly told, was effectively closed. Something else had killed the king, and the leg fracture had become the new leading suspect. That fracture led to a theory that felt almost cinematic. A group of British researchers, working with detailed CT data, built what they described as a virtual autopsy, a digital reconstruction of the body and its injuries. Their analysis found that the damage to Tutankhamun's body was concentrated on one side, consistent with a single violent impact, rather than a struggle or an attack. The leading interpretation was that the young king had been badly injured in some kind of accident, most likely a fall, possibly while riding a chariot during a hunt in the desert, an activity we know from tomb artwork and inscriptions that Tutankhamun did take part in. The fractured femur, badly broken shortly before death, would have been an extremely serious injury in the ancient world. Without modern surgery, antibiotics, or blood transfusion, a compound fracture like that could easily become infected, and a bone infection in a major limb was frequently fatal within days or weeks. For a while, this became the tidy, satisfying answer. Boy King dies in a hunting accident. Case closed, some researchers said at the time. Except it wasn't quite that simple, and later research complicated the chariot story in an interesting way. Some of the same researchers who studied the virtual reconstruction later pointed out that Tutankhamun's body showed signs of significant physical impairment, poor bone density in one foot, a foot condition affecting his gait, and other skeletal issues that would have made vigorous chariot riding difficult or even physically implausible for him. If his body truly was as compromised as some studies suggested, the image of him charging through the desert at speed on a hunting chariot became harder to square with what his skeleton actually showed. That doesn't rule out an accident entirely. He could still have fallen from a distance, been thrown from a vehicle at low speed, or been injured in some other physical mishap. But it did mean the picture was murkier than a single dramatic hunting accident. The fracture was real. What caused it, and how active he actually was at the time, remained genuinely uncertain. The real turning point in understanding Tutankhamun's death didn't come from another look at his bones. It came from his blood, or more precisely, from the genetic material still locked inside his mummified tissue. In 2010, Egyptian Antiquities Chief Zahi Hawass led an international team of researchers from Egypt, Germany, and Italy in the most comprehensive study of the royal mummies ever conducted. Over roughly 2 years, the team performed genetic, fingerprinting, anthropological examination, and radiological scanning on 16 mummies connected to the 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun's own royal line. The results, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, answered questions that had lingered for decades and raised troubling new ones at the same time. The genetic testing confirmed something researchers had long suspected but never proven, that Tutankhamun's parents were siblings. His father was almost certainly the mummy known as KV-55, widely believed to be Akhenaten himself, and his mother was one of 2 unidentified female mummies found in tomb KV-35, a woman who tested as Akhenaten's own sister. In ancient Egyptian royal families, marriage between close relatives, including full siblings, was not unusual. It was practiced deliberately to keep the bloodline consolidated within the ruling family and preserve claims to divine kingship. But biology does not care about political tradition, and the genetic risks of that kind of close relative pairing are well understood today. The closer the genetic relationship between 2 parents, the higher the likelihood that harmful recessive traits, ones that would normally be masked if a child inherited only one copy, get expressed in the child because they inherit 2 matching copies instead. Bone disorders, immune deficiencies, and developmental abnormalities become significantly more likely. That is exactly the pattern the researchers found in Tutankhamun's body. He had a cleft palate, he had a club foot on one side, and critically, imaging revealed a condition called Köhler disease II, a rare disorder that causes a bone in the foot to lose its blood supply and begin to die, a process called avascular necrosis. CT scans confirmed active necrosis in the bones of his left foot. This wasn't a minor cosmetic issue. It would have caused him ongoing pain and made walking difficult and unstable for years. And this is where the archaeological evidence lines up almost perfectly with the medical evidence. Inside Tutankhamun's tomb, excavators found well over 100 walking canes, some plain, some elaborately decorated, and several showing visible wear consistent with actual use rather than purely ceremonial display. A teenage pharaoh surrounded by the most extravagant wealth in the ancient world apparently could not walk comfortably without support. The objects buried with him tell the same story his bones do. Then came the part of the 2010 study that turned out to be the most consequential piece of the entire puzzle. Researchers tested genetic material from several of the mummies for traces of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite responsible for the deadliest and most dangerous form of malaria in humans, transmitted through mosquito bites. They found it. Not in one mummy, but in several, including Tutankhamun himself, and not as a single trace, but as evidence of multiple distinct genetic strains. That detail matters enormously because it means Tutankhamun wasn't infected once. He was infected. Repeatedly over the course of his short life, each new bout adding further strain to a body that was already working with a compromised immune system and deteriorating bone structure. At the time, this was described as the oldest confirmed genetic evidence of malaria ever found in a human being. Direct physical proof that one of the deadliest diseases in human history was already circulating along the Nile more than 3,000 years ago. And the malaria wasn't confined to Tutankhamun alone. The same study identified evidence of the parasite in mummies believed to be his grandparents, the powerful pharaoh Amenhotep III and his queen Tiye. That finding suggested malaria wasn't a single unlucky infection Tutankhamun happened to pick up. It suggested a disease that had been circulating through this specific royal family for at least a generation before he was even born, in a Nile Valley environment that, with its marshes, irrigation canals, and stagnant water, would have been an ideal breeding ground for the mosquitoes that carry it. Put all of that together, and the picture that emerges is not one dramatic event, but a convergence of several serious problems hitting a single, already fragile body at once. A genetic bone disorder that had been quietly killing tissue in his foot for years. A weakened immune system, likely made worse by the very inbreeding that caused his skeletal problems in the first place. Repeated, severe malaria infections layered on top of that immune weakness. And then, near the very end of his life, a serious fracture to his thigh, an injury that in a healthy young adult might have been survivable with rest and care, but in a body already this compromised had a real chance of triggering a fatal infection or pushing an already struggling system past the point of recovery. Hawass and his colleagues concluded that this combination, a vascular bone necrosis layered with malarial infection, was the most likely cause of death. Not a single smoking gun, but a body failing on multiple fronts simultaneously, worn down by genetics that were decided the moment his parents chose, or were expected, to marry each other. Research on Tutankhamun didn't stop there, and in the years since, scientists have kept circling back to refine and challenge that picture. A study published in 2024 proposed an additional detail worth mentioning, that alongside the bone disease and malaria, a ruptured spleen, potentially connected to the same physical trauma that fractured his leg, could have contributed to a rapid, catastrophic decline. Splenic rupture is a genuinely life-threatening emergency, even with modern surgery, causing severe internal bleeding, and in the ancient world, it would have been essentially untreatable. This combination theory doesn't overturn the malaria and bone disease findings, it builds on them, offering one more plausible mechanism for how a body already this weakened could have died so quickly once the final trauma occurred. Not every recent theory is held up as well. In 2023, one Egyptologist publicly floated a more colorful idea that Tutankhamun may have been intoxicated at the time of a fatal chariot accident, pointing to the substantial stores of wine, including newly identified evidence of white wine, found within his tomb. It's an interesting footnote about how seriously the royal court took its afterlife provisions, and it's true the tomb contained a genuinely large wine collection. But as a cause of death theory, it remains speculative and largely unsupported by direct physical evidence, more of an intriguing aside than a serious rival to the malaria and bone disease findings that are actually grounded in DNA and skeletal pathology. The most recent chapter in this story arrived in 2025, when researchers from Egypt's National Research Center in Cairo, working again with German DNA specialists, revisited the genetic material from Tutankhamun and his close relatives using updated analytical techniques. Their findings didn't overturn the 2010 conclusions, they reinforced them. The renewed testing again pointed to repeated serious bouts of malaria layered onto the health consequences of his parents' close blood relationship as the most credible explanation for his early death. What had once been a single controversial study from one team in 2010 has now been echoed, tested, and largely confirmed by independent researchers working with newer tools 15 years later. That kind of repeated confirmation, across different research groups and different points in time, is about as close to scientific consensus as ancient forensic pathology gets. And this is really the terrifying part, if you sit with it for a second. Tutankhamun's death wasn't caused by an enemy, a conspiracy, or even really by bad luck in the way we usually think about it. His fate was, in a very real sense, encoded before he was ever born, written into his DNA by a marriage his parents entered into to satisfy religious and political tradition. He spent his entire short life fighting a war inside his own body that he had no chance of winning. And every object placed in his tomb, the dozens of canes, the stockpiled medicines, the wine, quietly documents just how hard and how uselessly people around him tried to keep him alive. Even with all of this evidence, it would be inaccurate to say the case is fully and permanently closed. Respected voices in Egyptology, including Christopher Naughton, former head of the Egypt Exploration Society, and one of the researchers who worked extensively on the virtual autopsy project, have pointed out that certain causes of death, a sudden cardiac event, an overwhelming systemic infection, don't necessarily leave any lasting trace on bone or preserved tissue, especially after 3,000 years of mummification and decay. It's entirely possible that some contributing factor in Tutankhamun's death simply didn't survive long enough in the archaeological record for any scanner or genetic test to ever detect it. Science can tell us what diseases and injuries this specific body definitely had. It can build the most probable explanation from that evidence. What it can't do is promise absolute certainty about the exact final moment 3,300 years after the fact. That uncertainty is precisely why researchers keep coming back to this one mummy again and again, applying each new generation of imaging and genetic technology in the hope of tightening the picture just a little further. No conversation about Tutankhamun's death would be complete without addressing the legend that grew up around his tomb after it was opened, the so-called curses of the pharaohs. In the years following the 1922 discovery, a striking number of people connected to the excavation died under circumstances that seemed, at least on the surface, eerily coincidental. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy financier behind the dig, died just a few months after entering the tomb, officially from blood poisoning combined with pneumonia following an infected mosquito bite. Rumors quickly spread that another expert had predicted his death almost to the exact week. Newspapers at the time seized on the story, and it has never fully let go of the public imagination since, showing up in documentaries and horror films for a century afterward. The scientific explanation is considerably less supernatural, but genuinely interesting in its own right. Tombs sealed for millennia can accumulate toxic mold spores and bacteria in the enclosed, undisturbed air, organisms capable of causing serious respiratory illness in anyone who breathes them in for the first time after the seal is finally broken. Several of the people connected to Carnarvon's death were also of advanced age or already in fragile health at the time. When you account for those factors, along with a simple statistical reality that hundreds of people were connected to the excavation over many years, meaning some number of deaths, even unusual ones, were essentially inevitable over that stretch of time, the pattern that looked so eerie in hindsight becomes much more explainable. It's less a curse and more a case of ordinary mortality dressed up in extraordinary circumstances, filtered through a press eager for a sensational headline. So where does that leave us? More than a century after Howard Carter first peered into the darkness of that tomb by candlelight, and more than 15 years after the first genetic tests came back, the evidence tells a consistent, layered story. A boy became king at 9 years old, inherited a fractured, unstable kingdom, and carried inside his own body the biological cost of his parents' union, deteriorating bone tissue in his foot, a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and an immune system that struggled to keep up. Malaria struck him again and again throughout his short life, each infection chipping away further at a body that had very little reserve left to draw on. Then, near the end, some kind of serious physical trauma, most likely a fall, fractured his thigh and may have injured internal organs as well, and that final blow proved to be more than his exhausted body could survive. Not one cause, a convergence of them, biological and circumstantial, all closing in on the same young king within the space of a few catastrophic days. It's worth pausing on just how unusual it is that we can say any of this with confidence at all. For the overwhelming majority of ancient royal deaths, we have nothing more to go on than fragmentary inscriptions, second-hand accounts written decades or centuries later, or simply silence. Most pharaohs' actual causes of death are complete guesswork, lost entirely to time. Tutankhamun is a strange exception precisely because he was forgotten so thoroughly and so quickly by his own culture. The neglect that erased him from official history is the same neglect that protected his body from the tomb robbers who stripped nearly every other royal burial in the Valley of the Kings, sometimes within a generation of the burial itself. In a very real sense, obscurity preserved him, and 3,000 years later that preserved body became one of the richest sources of biological data ever recovered from the ancient world, letting modern researchers reconstruct not just a cause of death, but an entire family's medical history across multiple generations. What makes this story genuinely remarkable isn't just the final diagnosis, it's what that diagnosis reveals about the limits and the power of science applied to the deep past. A body sealed away for over 3,000 years can still, through careful genetic sequencing and imaging technology its original owners couldn't have dreamed of, tell us not just how someone died, but the biological decisions and circumstances that made that death almost inevitable long before it happened. Somewhere behind that iconic golden mask was an actual teenager, one who could barely walk without support, who fought off malaria more than once, and who never got the chance to grow old enough to see whether his kingdom would recover the stability he'd worked to restore. 3,300 years later, his body is still speaking, and scientists are still learning how to listen. What do you think actually finished off the boy king? Was it the malaria, the broken leg, or something that hasn't been found yet? Let me know your take in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more deep dives into the mysteries of the ancient world unpacked with real science instead of speculation, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more history waiting to be decoded right here on this channel.